They say the Slavs swept into Europe like a tidal wave. But what if the real story is buried in the bones beneath our feet? In the early medieval centuries, Slavic tribes surged across Eastern Europe, bringing their language, their customs, and their blood. But in Poland, the very heart of the Slavic world, something doesn't add up. When scientists opened ancient Roman-era graves near the Vistula River and extracted DNA from the bones of long-dead women, they found something shocking. The genetic code matched modern Polish mothers. Not just similar, identical. Haplogroups like H5A1 and N1A1A2 remained uninterrupted, unbroken, stretching back more than 3,000 years. And here's the contradiction. The history books say Slavs migrated in the 5th and 6th centuries, but the maternal DNA never moved. The women were already there, and they stayed. So a troubling question emerges. If the Polish mothers never left, who were the men that came? Because the fathers tell a different story. The Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, shows a dramatic shift. From haplogroup I1 in the Iron Age to R1A, specifically M458 and Z280 in the Middle Ages. This wasn't cultural blending. It was replacement. And now, the myth begins to fracture. Maybe Slavic identity didn't come from a single people, but from a collision where outside men met the daughters of the land. So what does it mean when your culture comes from one side, but your bloodline from another? And if the mothers carried ancient memory, and the fathers arrived speaking something new, then who were these men? Where did they come from? And how did their legacy rewrite the genetic map of a nation? We're about to follow their trail, across centuries, across borders, through the war-torn soils of East Central Europe, into the real story behind Polish DNA, and the truth of the Slavic migration. Their fingerprints are everywhere, etched into the Y chromosomes of modern Poles, whispered through the bones pulled from medieval cemeteries. In just a few centuries, the paternal story of this land flipped. Before 400 CE, the dominant male lineage was I1 and I1A, linked to older, local European groups, with deep roots across Scandinavia and the northern continent. But by the 10th century, they were gone. In their place, R1A. And not just any R1A. Subclades like R1A S198 and R1A M458 lineages that now make up over half of Polish male ancestry. A silent revolution. A genetic conquest. But this wasn't genocide. There are no mass graves, no signs of war sweeping across every village. What we see instead is integration, intermarriage, local Iron Age women giving birth to children of newcomers. A cultural takeover, not by sword, but by marriage. In 2021, a groundbreaking study by Stolarek et al. Examined 474 ancient skeletons from 27 cemeteries across Poland. The result? Iron Age men showed Northern European I1 lineages. But just a few hundred years later, middle-aged males overwhelmingly carried R1A. A complete turnover of fathers, not mothers. It wasn't exterminated. It was a replacement hidden in plain sight, behind shared surnames, adopted languages, borrowed rituals. And it raises a haunting question. Was it love? Or was it something else? Because this wave didn't just bring new genetics. It brought new words. Slavic dialects, emerging between 500 and 600 CE, began to dominate. Local languages vanished. Folklore shifted. Burial customs changed. But the bones, the maternal bones, stayed the same. Imagine that a woman, born into an Iron Age tribe, speaking an old tongue, marrying a man who called himself Slavic. Her children? They'd carry his name, his language, his Y DNA. But inside their blood, her story survived. A story we're only just beginning to unlock. But to truly understand the shift, we need to follow the path of these R1A men, back in time, to the lands they left behind, to the moment their bloodlines were born. Because the question isn't just where they came from. It's why then. Why did this migration happen in the 5th and 6th centuries? And what triggered it? Because the farther we chase the trail of these R1A men, the more the story flips. What looks like an invasion begins to feel like a return. Take R1A M458, one of the dominant paternal lineages in modern Polish men, found in nearly half of them today. For years, it was assumed this marker came from the East, carried by nomads, warriors, migrants. But then came the shock. A 2022 phylogenetic analysis dated the root of M458 to almost 11,000 years ago, and the epicenter? Right here, in what we now call Poland. Not Ukraine, not the steppes. Poland, the homeland of the so-called invaders, may have always been under their feet. Even deeper, subclade R1a L260, the most distinctly West Slavic branch, peaks in Poland and Slovakia, with the highest frequencies traced across the very rivers once believed to be Slavic frontiers. The Vistula, the odor, the bug. Its diversification pattern doesn't radiate outward. It coils inward like roots. And R1a Z280, found from Belarus to the Baltic Sea, but centered heavily in Poland. All three of these subclades suggest the same unsettling truth, that many of the men labeled as migrants in the 500s may have simply been coming home. Could it be that the early Slavs weren't foreign intruders, but the children of a forgotten fatherland? Archaeogenetic studies from the Lusatian and Chucyniec cultures, dating back to the Bronze Age, 1,300 to 500 BCE, show a strong presence of R1a lineages. These were not foreign warriors. These were local tribes. Proto-Slavic in language? Maybe. But genetically, undeniably homegrown. So what happened? Why did their bloodlines vanish for centuries, only to reappear, roaring back into dominance during the early medieval age? What force, what storm, swept through Central Europe, breaking continuity, displacing men, and leaving only the women behind? Because if these men were not outsiders, if they were the sons of these valleys, the descendants of Bronze Age warriors and farmers, then the next question cuts even deeper. If they were returning, what forced them to leave in the first place? To answer that, we have to dig beneath the surface. Not just the soil, but the stories we've been told. Because under the lands of the Vistula Basin, something remarkable was waiting to be uncovered. In 2014, a landmark mitochondrial DNA study by Juris et al. Analyzed burials from two key periods, the Roman Iron Age and the early Middle Ages. The samples, pulled from ancient cemeteries across Poland, showed maternal haplogroups that matched modern Polish populations almost exactly. Haplogroups like H5A1 and N1A1A2 weren't just present. They were continuous, across nearly 2,000 years. But the revelations didn't stop there. In 2023, a genomic analysis published by Stolarek and colleagues used over 200 genome-wide sequenced individuals from the Przeworsk and Wielbar cultures, dated between 400 BCE and 500 CE. The result? Overwhelming genetic continuity with present-day Poles, autosomal DNA, Y-chromosome lineages, and even predicted phenotypes all aligned. This wasn't just a trace. This was direct biological inheritance. And yet, archaeologists had long labeled these cultures as Germanic. The Przeworsk culture was linked to Vandals and other tribes. The Wielbar culture, centered in modern northern Poland, was connected to the Goths. These labels, built in the 19th century by German scholars, serve political agendas as much as academic ones. But the bones had no loyalty. Their DNA shattered the myth. This is where archaeogenetics confronts propaganda. The Lusatian culture, which flourished from the late Bronze Age through the early Iron Age, spanning 1300 to 500 BCE, was once thought to be pre-Slavic. But new data shows R1a, M458, and Z280 already embedded in its population, the same lineages carried by modern Slavic men. The bodies buried with handmade ceramics, bronze ornaments, and fire rituals weren't foreigners. They were proto-Poles. And yet, none of them were ever called Slavs. That word, that identity, doesn't appear in the record until the 6th century, right when the Byzantine historian Procopius suddenly described a great rising, a flood of Slavic-speaking people moving across the Danube. But the DNA tells us those people had been here all along. So if these cultures, Przeworsk, Lusatian, Wielbar, were biologically continuous with modern Poles, and their languages were shifting gradually over centuries, then what really happened? Because the chronicles speak of a sudden wave, a great migration, a flood of strangers. But if they weren't strangers, then why do the chronicles speak of sudden Slavic floods? Because what the records describe as a flood may have been something else entirely. Not a wave of people, but a wave of language, culture, identity, autosomal DNA, the full genomic picture, inherited from both mother and father, tells a story that challenges everything. When researchers compared Iron Age and early medieval samples across East Central Europe, they found no sudden break, no sharp turn in ancestry. The same genetic signatures, West Eurasian, corded where derived, local, remained steady. From the Roman Iron Age, through the 6th century, into today. Why DNA does shift. The rise of our 1A subclades is real. But mitochondrial DNA? The maternal side? It doesn't flinch. Haplogroup H5A1, U5, J1C, all still there. Women of the land, raising children who spoke a new language, but carried an old genome. And here lies the paradox. How can a population change without actually moving? What if the Slavic migration wasn't entirely about migration? Linguists today believe Proto-Slavic emerged locally, likely between the Oder and Dnieper, sometime between 1500 BCE and 500 CE. And then, almost overnight, it was everywhere, from the Elbe to the Volga, across the Balkans, into the Carpathians, a single language family exploding across a continent. But languages don't always need armies. Sometimes they spread like fire, not by force, but by adaptation. A dominant elite, a charismatic culture, a crumbling empire leaving power vacuums behind. Slavic speech may have risen not because Slavs replaced others, but because others became Slavs. And this isn't just theory. In 2023, a pan-European genome study across over 500 medieval and Iron Age individuals confirmed it. The genetic shifts were subtle, not sweeping. The spread of Slavic culture appears in situ, formed locally, amplified regionally, only lightly layered with external ancestry. Imagine a vast grassland, dry from decades of decay, and then a spark. One tongue, one mythos, one idea of kinship. That's all it took. Because identity isn't just in the blood, it's in the stories we tell, the language we inherit, the names we answer to, even when the genome says otherwise. But there's one piece that breaks the pattern, one anomaly buried in geography. Because some lands change more than others, why? To find the answer, we follow the Slavic trail south, into the Balkans. At first glance, it looks the same. Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, all Slavic languages, all born from the same Proto-Slavic root. But the genes tell a different story. R1A, the paternal backbone of the Slavic genome, runs strong in Poland, over 56%. In Ukraine and Belarus, still dominant. But cross into Serbia, and it drops below 35%. In Croatia, even lower. By the time you reach Greece, it sinks to less than 20%. What happened? The answer is in the collision between Slavic newcomers and the ancient peoples of the Balkans. Thracians, Illyrians, Romanized locals, populations already rooted deep before the Slavs ever arrived. And when they did arrive, between the 6th and 7th century CE, as recorded by Byzantine sources like Procopius and Theophylact Simocatta, they didn't come alone. But they didn't come in force either. They came as waves, clans, small tribal groups. And when they entered this rugged, mountainous, already crowded land, they didn't replace. They merged. DNA studies from ancient Balkan remains, like those from the Iron Gates region and early medieval Serbian sites, show clear admixture patterns. Slavic paternal lineages entered, but mixed rapidly with local mitochondrial lines. The result? A population that sounds Slavic, but carries a distinctly Balkan genetic fingerprint. You can see it in the food, the burial rites, the social structure. In Poland, cremation remained common into the early medieval era, a holdover from older Central European customs. But in the Balkans, Slavic burials begin to reflect Christian rituals, Roman-style inhumations, and local funerary traditions. Not erased, absorbed. And yet, despite the genetic dilution, the language stuck. Across Bosnia, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, Slavic dialects survived centuries of Ottoman conquest, Roman religion, and native resistance. But the blood beneath shifted. How can a person speak one language, but remember another life, another ancestry, in their bones? This is the Balkan contradiction. Slavic identity on the surface, Balkan memory underneath. But the real question burns elsewhere. Because while South Slavic DNA bent and blended, so why did Polish DNA remain so uniquely intact? To understand that, we don't start with warriors, we start with women. Because while kingdoms rose and fell, while borders bled and languages changed, the Polish mother stayed. Her blood never left. Haplogroup H5A1, found in Iron Age burials near Krakow, dated to around 200 BCE. Still present in modern Polish women today. N1A1A2, another matriline, buried in the soil of the Roman period, reappears in 21st century genetic surveys. NU5, one of the oldest European lineages, born in the Ice Age, passed down by mothers who lit fires in Bronze Age huts, who witnessed Slavic languages take shape, and who survived the storms of the medieval world. These aren't just markers. They're memories, traced not in names or titles, but in bloodlines that refuse to vanish. When researchers compared ancient and modern mitochondrial DNA across Poland, including studies by Juris et al., 2014, and more recent analyses from the University of Lodz, the pattern was undeniable. Maternal lineages in Poland show some of the strongest continuity in all of Central Europe. Roman Iron Age, medieval, modern, no reset, no break. The men changed. The Y DNA shows it. I1 became R1A. Northern influences gave way to Eastern ones. But the mothers? Their code flowed steady, through invasions, through cultural shifts, through genocide and partition. Imagine a woman in the 2nd century, speaking a vanished tongue, living under Roman trade winds, giving birth to children who would one day speak Slavic, then Latin, then Polish. Now imagine her great-granddaughter in the 10th century, under the Piast dynasty, raising a son who carries his father's Slavic surname, but her Ice Age blood. This is the unbroken chain. A quiet resistance, a living archive. But it wasn't invincible, because in the 20th century, something happened, not thousands of years ago, but within living memory, that came closer than anything else in history to severing this ancient line. So if continuity held strong, what nearly broke it? It wasn't a Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't a Roman withdrawal. It wasn't even the early Slavic migrations. It was war. Modern war. Brutal, mechanical, and deliberate. In 1945, the borders of Poland shifted west. Millions of people, nearly 1 in 3, were forced from their homes. Expelled, resettled, erased. German families who'd lived east of the Oder for generations were pushed out. Poles from the east, from Lwów, from Vilnius, from what is now Ukraine and Belarus, were uprooted and dropped into Silesia, into Pomerania, into cities they'd never known. And beneath the chaos of these human tragedies, the genes moved too. In a 2019 study published in Nature Communications, researchers analyzed Y chromosome data from modern Polish populations and discovered something strange. While the maternal lineages remained richly diverse and ancient, the paternal DNA looked different, too smooth, too uniform, a pattern only possible when local male diversity is wiped out and replaced. The numbers don't lie. Before the war, regional variations in Y DNA were well documented. Some areas leaned heavier on R1A L260, others on I2. Still others carried echoes of Germanic R1B. But after 1945, the map flattened. R1A rises to nearly 57% across the board, a genetic monoculture born not from nature, but from policy. This wasn't evolution. It was a reorganization, demographic engineering at national scale. And now, even today, that invisible line still marks the western edge of Poland, not in language, not in culture, but in genes. A sharp genetic discontinuity, recorded in the work of Jarczak et al. And Stolarek et al., cuts across the modern Polish-German border, a living memory of forced migration, of lives torn from soil and replanted somewhere else. It begs the question, can a people remain the same when their past has been moved? When their surnames, their dialects, their graves no longer match their geography? And yet, despite all that was lost, all that was scrambled and redrawn, yet even war couldn't erase one thread, the thread of R1A, the ancient paternal signature, still carried by nearly 57% of Polish men today. Not diluted, not displaced, but steady, like a signal that never lost frequency. This isn't speculation. It's written in thousands of genomes, sequenced in labs from Krakow to Copenhagen. In 2022, the Genealogical Journal of Human Genetics reported one of the highest frequencies of R1am458 and R1Z280 among Polish males, a lineage rooted in the corded ware culture, thriving since 2800 BCE, unbroken despite empires, partitions, and war. Even after the devastation of World War II, after forced displacements reshuffled the national map, R1A stood firm. It appears in every Polish region, from Masovia to Silesia, in rural villages and industrial cities, like an ancestral watermark that survived even the cleanest erasures. And the most fascinating part? It didn't just survive, it spread. Genetic homogenization, triggered by post-war relocation, created a strange effect. Local distinctions blurred, regional paternal subclades mixed, and what emerged was unity, a national ancestry stitched from ancient roots, pulled tight by modern history. Now, when researchers run principal component analyses on Polish DNA, they see something rare, a cluster, a defined group, not scattered fragments of tribes, but a cohesive population with deep internal similarity, a people shaped not just by genes, but by the endurance of a single lineage. It's not just in the numbers, it's in the symbolism. The R1A haplogroup is like a rune, glowing faintly in every Polish genome, a whisper from the past, embedded in the bones of the living. From the Bronze Age warriors of the Vistula to the peasants of the Piast dynasty, to the resistance fighters of the 20th century, a through line of fathers. Names may change, dialects may bend, but the chromosome remains. And now, after centuries of migration, assimilation, and suppression, language, customs, and blood finally align. The culture speaks Slavic. The people carry Slavic DNA. And for the first time, they reflect each other. But the story doesn't end in unity. Because one question still haunts the labs, the dig sites, the scholars. One puzzle that DNA hasn't solved. Because one mystery still divides the scholars. And that mystery is origin. Not in the genetic code, but in the meaning behind it. In the battle that has raged for over a century between two visions of the Slavic past, the autochthonous theory and the migrationist one. The first claims the Slavs were always here, that they emerged in the Vistula Basin, long before the chronicles named them, that they are native to the soil, the rivers, the trees. The second insists they came later, from the Dniepr frontier, sweeping in like a tide during the early medieval centuries. But here's the twist. DNA now shows both were right, and both were wrong, because the evidence doesn't follow borders. It follows blood. Genome-wide sequencing of over 1,000 ancient individuals across Europe, including studies from the Max Planck Institute and Polish-led teams like Stolarek, Juris, and Kylensky, reveals a layered truth. The early Slavs weren't born in one moment. They were a synthesis, a long cultural fermentation, stretching from the Bronze Age to the Byzantine frontier. Yes, our 1am458 and Z280 lineages concentrate in modern Poland, but their roots stretch wide, into the steppe, into the forest zones, into cultures that predate the word Slav by centuries. And the language? It didn't arrive with one tribe. It crystallized, somewhere between the Oder and the Dnieper, then fractured, spreading like pollen, north into Poland, south into the Balkans, west into Bohemia. It was adopted, absorbed, carried by people whose genes often told different stories. This is not the tale of one tribe. It's the tale of entanglement, of local women and foreign sons, of shifting borders and redefined gods, of Slavic identity being built not on purity, but on survival. Maybe there is no single homeland. Maybe the Slavic story is not about where they came from, but how they endured, how they adapted, how they became. Because in the end, identity isn't just a place. It's a story, a myth we choose to pass down, a truth made from memory more than blood. And in the next episode, we cross the Carpathians into lands that broke the mold. Next episode, what Balkan DNA reveals about the Slavs who stayed and those who vanished.